The morning I opened my front door to find Patricia standing there with her clipboard and that familiar look of manufactured authority on her face, I knew my peaceful Tuesday was about to go sideways. I am Andrew Kellerman, and I have lived in the Riverside Heights subdivision in Burlington, Vermont for the past 7 years. It's a decent enough neighborhood, positioned right along the Winooski River with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. The winters here are brutal, which is why I always prepare properly. This particular winter was shaping up to be one of the worst we had seen in a decade, with meteorologists predicting record snowfall and ice accumulation throughout January and February. Patricia Henderson, the president of our Homeowners Association, and a woman who seemed to derive all of her life's purpose from making everyone else miserable, stood on my doorstep, wearing a parka that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and her lips were pressed into that thin line that meant she was about to say something I would not like. "Andrew," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I need to discuss something important with you." I glanced at my watch. It was 7 in the morning. I had not even finished my first cup of coffee. "Can this wait until a more reasonable hour?" I asked. "No, it cannot. This is HOA business." She pushed past me into my house without waiting for an invitation, and I felt my jaw clench. This was typical Patricia behavior, but it never stopped being infuriating. I closed the door against the cold and followed her into my living room, where she was already making herself comfortable on my couch, clipboard balanced on her lap. "I'll get straight to the point," she said. "We know you have a significant salt inventory stored in your garage." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process this statement. And the HOA board has decided that in the interest of community welfare, residents with excess supplies should share them with the neighborhood. "We're implementing a community resource sharing program." I laughed. I could not help it. "You're joking." Her expression hardened. "I am absolutely not joking. We have 43 homes in this subdivision, and we've received reports that you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 bags of ice melt and rock salt in your garage. That's excessive and selfish." Excessive and selfish. I bought that salt with my own money. I purchased it back in October when it was on sale, specifically because I knew we were going to have a harsh winter. That's called planning ahead, Patricia. She made a note on her clipboard, which only irritated me further. The HOA handbook states that residents must contribute to the general welfare of the community. Section 12, subsection 4. That section refers to maintaining property values and following aesthetic guidelines. It has nothing to do with my personal property stored in my own garage. Patricia stood up, smoothing down her expensive parka. "The board is meeting tonight at 7. You are required to attend. We'll be voting on the resource sharing mandate. I expect you to bring an inventory of your salt supplies." She walked toward the door, then turned back. "And Andrew, this isn't a request. Failure to comply will result in fines." After she left, I stood in my living room, coffee growing cold in my hand, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I had dealt with Patricia's nonsense for years. She had fined me for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 4 hours. She had sent me a violation notice because my lawn was a 1/4 inch taller than the mandated maximum height. She had even tried to fine my neighbor for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, claiming it was an unapproved structure. But this was different. This was not about aesthetics or property values. This was about my personal property, things I had purchased with my own money for my own use. I spent the rest of the day doing research. I pulled out my HOA documents, all 37 pages of them, and read through every single word. Patricia was right that Section 12. Subsection 4 mentioned contributing to community welfare, but the language was vague and clearly intended to cover things like keeping your property maintained, not surrendering your personal belongings. I also did some research on Vermont property law and HOA regulations. What I found was interesting. While HOAs in Vermont have significant power, they cannot simply confiscate or demand personal property without proper legal standing. Any amendment to HOA rules requiring such action would need to be voted on by the entire community, not just the board, and would require a 2/3 majority. At 6:30 that evening, I bundled up against the cold and walked 3 houses down to Patricia's home, where HOA meetings were always held. Her house was the largest in the subdivision, a sprawling colonial with pretentious columns flanking the front door. Inside, the other board members were already gathering. The board consisted of Patricia, her best friend Brenda Morrison, a timid man named Gerald Foster who never disagreed with Patricia, and Robert Chen, a software engineer who at least occasionally showed signs of independent thought. I took a seat in the folding chairs set up in Patricia's oversized living room. Several other neighbors were there too. I recognized Tom Webster from 2 streets over, Sandra Mills who lived across from me, and a handful of others. Patricia called the meeting to order with all the ceremony of someone chairing a session of Congress rather than a neighborhood HOA meeting. "First order of business," she announced. "The Community Resource Sharing Initiative. As I'm sure you're all aware, we're facing a difficult winter. Salt and ice melt are in short supply at local stores and prices have increased dramatically. However, some members of our community," she looked directly at me, "have been hoarding supplies." "I'm not hoarding anything," I said calmly. "I bought salt for my own use." 200 bags is not for your own use. That's hoarding, plain and simple. Meanwhile, elderly residents like Brenda's mother can't get salt anywhere, and the HOA's own supplies are running low. Brenda nodded vigorously. "My mother is 83. She fell on her icy walkway last week because she didn't have enough salt to put down." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "But that doesn't give you the right to take my property." Robert cleared his throat. "Andrew raises a valid point. The HOA can't just demand people turn over their personal belongings. That's not how any of this works." Patricia shot him a withering look. "We're not taking anything. We're asking for voluntary contributions to a community pool. Of course, residents who refuse to contribute voluntarily will face fines for violating the Community Welfare Clause." "That's extortion," I said flatly. "That's ensuring the safety and well-being of our residents," Patricia countered. The meeting devolved into an argument. Patricia wanted to pass a measure that would fine any resident with more than 20 bags of salt $50 per day until they contributed their excess to the HOA. Other residents chimed in, some supporting Patricia, others questioning the legality of such a measure. Tom Webster raised his hand. "I have a question. If we contribute our salt to the HOA, how exactly will it be distributed?" "The board will determine distribution based on need," Patricia said. "So you'll control who gets salt and who doesn't?" Tom asked. "Someone has to make those decisions," Brenda said defensively. I could see where this was going. Patricia and her cronies would control a community salt supply and use it as leverage over the neighborhood. Need salt. Better not be on Patricia's bad side. After an hour of debate, Patricia called for a vote on the resource sharing mandate. By a vote of 3-1, with only Robert dissenting, the board passed the measure. Any resident with more than 20 bags of ice melt or rock salt would be fined $50 per day, starting in 72 hours, unless they contributed their excess to the community pool. I left the meeting furious but already formulating a plan. If Patricia wanted to play games, I could play games too. The next morning, I spent 2 hours on the phone. I called every landscaping company, property management company, and commercial property owner in the Burlington area. I had 217 bags of premium ice melt and rock salt in my garage. Most of it was the expensive calcium chloride blend that works down to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, much better than the cheap rock salt most people use. By noon, I had sold every single bag. A property management company that maintained 3 shopping centers and a dozen office buildings bought the entire lot for twice what I had paid for it back in October. They sent a truck that afternoon, and by 4 in the evening, my garage was empty. I took photos documenting the empty space and the receipt of sale. Then I sat back and waited. The snow started that night. By morning, we had 8 inches of fresh powder and the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. The snow was that heavy, wet kind that packs down into ice when people walk or drive on it. By mid-morning, the subdivision was a skating rink. I watched from my window as Patricia emerged from her house, picking her way carefully down her unsalted driveway. She made it about 5 steps before her feet went out from under her. She did not fall, but it was close, and I could see the anger on her face even from my house. 20 minutes later, she was pounding on my door. "Where is it?" she demanded the moment I opened the door. "Where is what?" "Your salt. I went past your house and I could see into your garage. It's empty." I smiled pleasantly. "Oh, that, I sold it." The color drained from her face, then rushed back in an angry red flush. "You what?" "I sold it, all of it, yesterday afternoon, to Greenfield Property Management. They gave me an excellent price too, well above retail." "You can't do that. The board passed a mandate. The board passed a mandate that doesn't go into effect for 72 hours. I had every right to sell my property before then. You should have made the mandate effective immediately." Patricia's hands clenched into fists. "You did this on purpose." "I exercised my property rights. You know, those things protected by law that you tried to violate. You're going to regret this, Andrew. I'll make sure of it." She turned and stalked back toward her house, slipping twice on her icy walkway. Over the next few days, the subdivision descended into chaos. The snow kept falling, and the temperature stayed well below freezing. The HOA's salt supplies, which Patricia had mentioned were running low, ran out completely. The main roads were treated by the city, but the subdivision's private streets and individual driveways and walkways became increasingly treacherous. I had kept back 10 bags of salt for my own use, hidden in my basement. My property remained clear and safe. Everyone else was not so lucky. Sandra Mills from across the street knocked on my door on day 3 of the deep freeze. "Andrew, I know you and Patricia have your issues, but do you have any salt you could spare? I've tried every store in a 30-mile radius, and everything is sold out." I felt bad for Sandra. She was a nice woman, a single mother with 2 young kids, and she had nothing to do with Patricia's schemes. "I have a little left," I said. "I'll bring some over." I gave Sandra 2 bags of salt, enough to keep her walkways clear for a while. Over the next few days, I did the same for a few other neighbors who I knew were decent people. Tom Webster got a bag. Old Mr. Harrison, who lived alone at the end of the street, got 2 bags, but I made sure Patricia saw me helping these people. I made sure she knew I had some salt left, but I was choosing to help everyone except those who had supported her ridiculous mandate. On day 5, the subdivision Facebook page exploded. Someone had posted photos of all the icy walkways and driveways with complaints about the lack of salt. Patricia responded. claiming that the HOA was working on acquiring more supplies, but that certain selfish residents had made the situation worse by refusing to contribute to the community pool. I posted my own response, including photos of the original meeting announcement, the text of the mandate, and screenshots of the Vermont property law statutes that made it clear the HOA had no legal right to confiscate personal property. I also posted the timeline, showing that I had sold my salt before the mandate went into effect, and I posted the receipt showing that I had sold it to a legitimate business for a fair price. The comments section became a war zone. Some people supported Patricia, claiming I should have been a good neighbor and shared. Others pointed out that Patricia had overstepped her authority and that I had every right to do what I wanted with my own property. Then, Tom Webster posted something interesting. He shared an email chain showing that Patricia had reached out to several suppliers about buying salt in bulk for the HOA back in November. The suppliers had offered reasonable prices, but Patricia had declined, saying the HOA didn't want to spend the money. She had apparently assumed that the subdivision's residents would have enough for themselves, and the HOA could just use its minimal supplies for common areas. In other words, Patricia had created this shortage through her own poor planning, and now she was trying to make it my problem. The Facebook war raged for days. Meanwhile, the weather got worse. We got another 6 inches of snow, followed by an ice storm that coated everything in a thick layer of glaze. The subdivision became genuinely dangerous. Several people fell, including Brenda's mother again, who ended up with a sprained wrist. I started to feel bad, not for Patricia, but for the innocent people who were suffering because of this situation. But I also knew that if I gave in now, it would just validate Patricia's belief that she could bully people into doing what she wanted. On day 8, things came to a head. I was in my living room when I heard shouting outside. I looked out to see Patricia and Brenda standing in my driveway, holding what looked like official documents. I went outside, carefully navigating my perfectly salted walkway. "Andrew Kellerman," Patricia said formally, "you are hereby being fined $500 for each day you have been in violation of the Community Welfare Clause. That's 8 days, for a total of $4,000. I looked at the paper she was holding out. It was an official-looking HOA violation notice, complete with a breakdown of fines and a demand for payment. "I'm not in violation of anything," I said calmly. "You have refused to contribute to the community welfare by sharing resources during a crisis situation." "I don't have resources to share. I sold my salt before your mandate went into effect. You kept some for yourself. We've seen you salting your property." "Yes, I kept enough for my personal use. Your mandate only requires sharing excess supplies. 20 bags or more, I believe, was the threshold." "I have fewer than 20 bags. This was technically true. I had 10 bags left." "You're playing word games," Brenda said shrilly. "People are getting hurt because of you." "People are getting hurt because Patricia refused to properly budget for salt supplies back when they were available and affordable. People are getting hurt because your board tried to solve that problem by stealing from residents instead of taking responsibility for poor planning." A small crowd had gathered. Several neighbors had come out to see what the commotion was about. Robert Chen was there, and he spoke up. "Patricia, he's right. I've been reviewing the documentation. The board should have authorized a bulk purchase back in the fall. We had the budget for it." "You declined because you said it was unnecessary," Patricia whirled on him. "We couldn't have predicted it would be this bad." "The Weather Service predicted exactly this back in September," Robert said. "I have the reports." More neighbors started chiming in. The crowd grew larger. People were angry, but increasingly that anger was directed at Patricia rather than at me. Sandra Mills spoke up. "Patricia, Andrew gave me salt when I needed it. He gave salt to Mr. Harrison and Tom and several others. For free. He didn't have to do that. He should have contributed to the community pool so distribution could be fair and equal." Patricia insisted. "You mean so you could control who gets it and who doesn't," Tom Webster said. "Come on, Patricia. We all know how this would have worked." Anyone who has ever disagreed with you would suddenly find themselves at the back of the line. The argument continued, with more neighbors joining in. Patricia tried to maintain control, but she was losing badly. Her face was red, and her voice had taken on a shrill, desperate quality. Finally, Gerald Foster, the timid board member who usually supported Patricia, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should call an emergency community meeting. Let everyone vote on this." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outnumbered and she knew it. "Fine. Tomorrow night. 7 o'clock. My house." The next evening, Patricia's living room was packed. 43 homes in the subdivision meant potentially 86 adults, and it looked like most of them had shown up. Folding chairs filled every available space, and people lined the walls. Patricia called the meeting to order, but the atmosphere was hostile. Before she could launch into her prepared remarks, Tom Webster stood up. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the current board," he said. "And I'm requesting a full audit of HOA finances and decision-making over the past year." The room erupted in voices. Patricia banged a gavel, trying to restore order. "You can't just call for a vote like that," she protested. Robert Chen pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws. "Actually, according to Article 7, Section 2, any resident can call for a vote of no confidence with supporting signatures from 20% of homeowners." "Tom, do you have the signatures?" Tom held up a clipboard. "I have 23 signatures. That's over 50% of our households." Patricia looked like she had been slapped. Brenda started to protest, but the crowd shouted her down. What followed was 3 hours of intense debate and discussion. Residents aired grievances about Patricia's leadership, about excessive fines for minor violations, about the board making decisions without community input. The salt situation was just the final straw. Multiple people spoke in my defense, pointing out that I had acted within my rights and had even helped neighbors out of my own pocket while the HOA had failed in its basic responsibilities. Finally, a vote was called. By a margin of 38-5, the community voted to remove Patricia, Brenda, and Gerald from the board. Only Robert Chen kept his position. 3 new board members were elected on the spot: Tom Webster, Sandra Mills, and a retired lawyer named Margaret Foster who had recently moved to the subdivision. Patricia did not take it well. She stood up, face purple with rage, and pointed at me. "This is all your fault. You've poisoned everyone against me." "No," I said calmly. "You did this to yourself. You've been a bully and a tyrant for years, and people are tired of it. The salt situation just made everyone realize it." She grabbed her expensive purse and stormed out of her own house, Brenda following behind. Gerald just sat there looking shell-shocked. The new board convened immediately. Their first act was to rescind the resource-sharing mandate. Their second act was to authorize an emergency purchase of salt for common areas, using HOA funds that Patricia had apparently been hoarding for reasons no one could explain. Margaret Foster, with her legal background, offered to review all of Patricia's actions over the past year to ensure everything had been above board. What she found was disturbing. Over the next week, as Margaret dug into the HOA finances, a pattern emerged. Patricia had been assessing fines liberally, but not all of that money had made it into the HOA accounts. Over the past 3 years, approximately $15,000 in collected fines had simply vanished. Additionally, Patricia had been paying herself and Brenda stipends for administrative work that were not authorized in the bylaws. In Vermont, HOA board members are generally considered to be in a fiduciary relationship with the homeowners. Misappropriation of funds is serious business. Margaret compiled her findings and presented them to the board, which then presented them to the community. The decision was unanimous. We were going to pursue legal action. I sat in the audience as Margaret explained the process. We would need to file a complaint, provide evidence, and likely end up in civil court. There was also the possibility of criminal charges if the prosecutor's office decided the evidence warranted it. "Is this really necessary?" someone asked. "I mean, she's already off the board." "Can't we just move on?" Margaret shook her head. "She stole from all of you. That money was your money, collected for the maintenance and improvement of this community. She needs to be held accountable, or she'll just do this somewhere else." The process took months. Margaret filed the initial complaint in February. Patricia hired a lawyer and denied everything. Brenda suddenly claimed she had no knowledge of any financial irregularities and tried to distance herself from the whole situation. But Margaret was thorough. She had bank records, copies of fine notices, and testimony from dozens of homeowners. She even found a few cases where Patricia had fined people for violations that did not exist in the HOA handbook, just making up rules as she went. In April, the prosecutor's office got involved. What had started as a civil matter now included criminal charges of embezzlement and fraud. Patricia was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning. I was not there to see it, but Tom Webster was, and he told me she screamed at the officers that this was all a witch hunt, that she had done nothing wrong. The trial was set for July. In the meantime, life in the subdivision slowly returned to normal. The new board was actually functional. Tom, Sandra, and Margaret worked with Robert to create a transparent system for decision-making. They held monthly meetings where any resident could voice concerns. They created a community fund for emergency supplies, including salt for the next winter. They also worked with the community to revise the HOA handbook, removing the vague language that Patricia had used to justify her overreach, and replacing it with clear, specific rules that protected homeowner rights while still maintaining community standards. My relationship with my neighbors improved significantly. People thanked me for standing up to Patricia, though I always felt a little weird about that. I had not done it to be a hero. I had done it because she was wrong and I was tired of being pushed around. The trial in July was almost anticlimactic. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that the missing money was due to accounting errors, that the unauthorized stipends were legitimate expenses, that Patricia had acted in good faith. But Margaret's documentation was airtight, and the prosecutor had done a thorough job. I attended the trial on the day the verdict was read. The courtroom was small, one of the district courtrooms in Burlington, with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches. Patricia sat at the defense table looking smaller somehow, diminished from the commanding presence she had tried to project for so long. The jury found her guilty on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. Brenda, who had taken a plea deal, testified against her, confirming that Patricia had indeed been pocketing fine money and that they had both been taking unauthorized payments. At sentencing in August, the judge was not sympathetic. Patricia received a sentence of 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year, along with restitution of all stolen funds plus interest. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state of Vermont. As I watched the bailiff lead her away, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice had been served. Sadness because it never should have come to this. If Patricia had just been a reasonable person, if she had respected people's rights and property, none of this would have happened. The salt situation seemed almost trivial now, looking back, but it had been the catalyst for everything else. My decision to sell my salt rather than be bullied into surrendering, it had sparked a chain of events that exposed years of corruption and abuse of power. The subdivision thrived under new leadership. Property values actually increased, which was ironic considering Patricia had always claimed her strict enforcement was necessary to maintain home values. Turns out people prefer to live in communities where they are not constantly harassed with fines and restrictions. The following winter was mild, but the HOA was prepared anyway. We had ample salt supplies, purchased through a transparent bidding process with 3 different suppliers. The costs were shared equally among all residents through a small increase in HOA dues, and no one complained because we all knew the money was being handled properly. I ran into Brenda once, at the grocery store in town. She was with her mother, the elderly woman who had fallen twice during the ice crisis. Brenda looked embarrassed when she saw me, and I thought she might just turn and walk away, but her mother stopped. "You're Andrew, aren't you?" the older woman asked, "the one who stood up to Patricia." "Yes, madam. I want to thank you. My daughter got caught up in something she shouldn't have, but she's learned from it. Haven't you, Brenda?" Brenda nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for all of it. Patricia was my friend and I just went along with whatever she said. I should have known better." "Yeah, you should have," I said. Then, after a moment, "But you testified when it mattered. That took guts." She finally looked at me. "It was the right thing to do. I just wish I had done the right thing earlier." Her mother patted her arm. "We all make mistakes, dear. What matters is that we learn from them." She turned to me. "Take care of yourself, young man. We need more people willing to stand up for what's right." As I drove home that day, I thought about the whole saga. It had started with something so simple, buying salt in bulk because I knew winter was coming. I had done what any reasonable person would do, preparing for foreseeable circumstances. But Patricia had seen that preparation as something she could exploit. She had seen my foresight as a resource she could control and distribute according to her whims. And when I refused to play along, she had tried to punish me. The thing was, Patricia had never understood the fundamental problem with her approach. You cannot lead a community through fear and intimidation. You cannot demand respect while showing none to others. You cannot expect people to surrender their rights and property just because you claim authority. Real leadership means serving the community, not ruling it. It means making decisions transparently, respecting people's rights, and taking responsibility when things go wrong. The new HOA board understood that. They were not perfect, but they tried, and they listened when people had concerns. I still lived in Riverside Heights. My house was still neat and well-maintained, my lawn still mowed to the appropriate height. But now I did those things because I wanted to, because I took pride in my home, not because I was afraid of arbitrary fines from a petty tyrant. The garage where I had once stored 200 bags of salt now held my car and the normal accumulation of tools and equipment that people gather over the years. I still bought salt each fall, but reasonable amounts. The HOA maintained a community supply that residents could access as needed, and the system worked. Sometimes, on cold winter mornings, I would look out my window at the well-salted streets and clear sidewalks, and think about that day when Patricia had stood in my living room demanding access to my property. I thought about how close she had come to getting away with it, how she might have continued her pattern of abuse and theft if not for that moment when I decided to push back. It had not been easy. There had been stress and conflict and months of legal proceedings, but it had been worth it. Not just for me, but for the whole community. Tom Webster liked to joke that I had saved the subdivision with rock salt, but that was not quite right. The salt had just been the occasion. What had saved the subdivision was people standing up for themselves, refusing to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. In the end, that was the real lesson. HOAs are supposed to serve homeowners, not the other way around. Boards are supposed to follow the rules, not make them up as they go. And when someone in authority abuses their power, it is everyone's responsibility to hold them accountable. I never set out to be a whistleblower or a community activist. I just wanted to keep my driveway clear during a harsh winter. But sometimes standing up for something small and simple can have ripple effects you never anticipated. Patricia served 13 months before being paroled. I heard she moved to Massachusetts after her release, living with a sister in Springfield. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, though I honestly doubted it. People like Patricia rarely changed. They just found new places to exercise their need for control. But that was not my problem anymore. My problem was living my life, being a good neighbor on my own terms, and making sure that the community I lived in remained a place where people could thrive without fear of arbitrary authority. On the anniversary of that first confrontation, exactly 1 year after Patricia had demanded access to my salt supply, the new HOA board threw a community picnic. It was a warm spring day, unseasonably pleasant, and almost everyone in the subdivision showed up. There were grills and folding tables laden with food, kids running around playing tag, and neighbors actually talking to each other like friends instead of eyeing each other suspiciously. Tom Webster made a speech, thanking everyone for their support during the transition and praising the community for standing together. He did not mention Patricia by name, but everyone knew what he was talking about. Sandra Mills caught my eye and raised her glass of lemonade in a silent toast. I raised mine back. We understood each other. We had all been through something difficult, and we had come out the other side better for it. As the sun set over the Winooski River and the party wound down, I walked back to my house, past my perfectly maintained lawn and up my clear walkway. Inside, everything was exactly as I liked it. My home, my property, my space. And in the garage, just to be prepared, I had 20 bags of salt waiting for next winter. Not because anyone demanded it, not because any board required it, but because I had learned my lesson about preparation. Though if anyone came asking to confiscate it, I had the number for Greenfield Property Management saved in my phone, and I knew they would be happy to buy my inventory again. Some lessons, after all, are worth remembering.